In a small, quiet town, a terrible secret was being kept behind closed doors. A local judge, once seen as a pillar of justice, was quietly working with powerful forces behind the scenes. This was no ordinary corruption. It was a scheme that traded the futures of children for profit, known as Kids for Cash. The ones pulling the strings? Private equity firms with deep pockets willing to invest in the darkest corners of society to extract profit. The story started when private equity began buying up juvenile detention centers. Their goal was simple: maximize profits by filling as many beds as possible. But empty cells meant no revenue. So they turned to the courts, targeting judges who were willing to send more kids to detention for minor offenses in exchange for bribes disguised as campaign donations or consulting fees. Judge Simmons was one such judge. He had started his career with good intentions, but over time the lure of wealth and power seduced him. Private equity firms had approached him, promising financial support for his re-election campaigns and hefty bonuses under the table if he ensured a steady flow of children into their detention centers. They didn't care if the offenses were trivial: skipping school, minor shoplifting, or even simply mouthing off to a teacher. The goal was to fill cells, and Judge Simmons became the key player in this monstrous game. Children as young as 12 were sent away for months, sometimes years, for things that should have warranted a stern warning or community service. Their lives were derailed, families were torn apart, and the trauma of being locked away in a for-profit system left deep, lasting scars. The children were treated like criminals, even if they had never committed a serious crime. They were pawns, shuffled into the system for the sole purpose of enriching private equity firms and corrupt officials. As the years went by, the human cost of this scheme became undeniable. Children who had once had bright futures were now left struggling with the trauma of incarceration. Some never returned to school, falling into cycles of poverty and crime. Others, unable to cope with the emotional toll, took their own lives. And all the while, the private equity executives celebrated record profits in boardrooms far removed from the suffering they had caused. But eventually, the truth began to unravel. Journalists started asking questions, noticing the sharp rise in juvenile incarcerations and the strange leniency shown to the companies running the detention centers. Whispers about Judge Simmons's role in the scheme grew louder until they could no longer be ignored. Investigations were launched, and soon, the full extent of the Kids for Cash operation was exposed. The outrage was immediate and widespread. Parents whose children had been unjustly locked away demanded justice. The public learned how private equity firms had manipulated the legal system, turning judges into accomplices in their pursuit of profit. Judge Simmons was disbarred and sentenced to prison, but for the countless children whose lives had been ruined, it was too late. The damage had been done. The story of Kids for Cash became a stark reminder of how greed could infect even the most sacred institutions, turning the pursuit of justice into a twisted, profit-driven enterprise. It showed how private equity, with its singular focus on maximizing returns, could exploit the most vulnerable members of society for gain. The ripple effects of this scandal would be felt for years, as the survivors of the system struggled to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the betrayal. In the end, it wasn't just Judge Simmons or the private equity firms that were at fault. It was a system that had allowed money to corrupt justice, where children's lives became expendable in the pursuit of wealth. The Kids for Cash scandal exposed a fundamental truth. When profit is prioritized over people, the consequences are devastating, especially for those with no voice to fight back.